came home at 9:37 on a Tuesday in November, and my hands were already numb from the walk from the parking lot. The dispatcher had called in sick that afternoon, so I'd stayed another 2 hours reorganizing the shipment logs, and before that, I'd been loading boxes in a bay that smells like metal and cold and something vaguely chemical that I've learned not to think about. My shoulders ached in that specific way that means I've held tension for too long, and my eyes felt like they'd been left open in the wind. The house on Eastbrook Avenue was quiet, except for the sound of the television bleeding through the walls from the living room. One of those baking competition shows my mother watches, the kind where people are always crying about their dead grandmothers and the importance of vanilla extract. The porch light was off, which meant I had to unlock the door slowly, testing each movement so I wouldn't bang into the coat rack that's been in the same spot for 12 years, and that I trip over at least once a season. Inside, the air was exactly the temperature it always is, just slightly too warm, stale from the radiator and closed windows, carrying the residual smell of the dinner I'd prepped on Sunday and reheated that morning before work. No one else had cooked. No one ever did. The kitchen was dark except for the light spilling in from the hallway, and I could see that someone had left a coffee cup on the counter, rings of dried coffee staining the ceramic. Not my cup. Not my mark. My mother emerged from the living room as I was still removing my coat, her cardigan wrapped around her body in that theatrical way that suggested she'd been cold all day, despite the fact that she hadn't left the house. "There you are," she said, as if I'd been expected earlier. As if there was some invisible schedule I should have consulted. "I was wondering when you'd be home. My feet are absolutely killing me, and I couldn't find the heating pad. Did you move it?" I set my keys in the bowl, the same bowl my father had used, now dented on one side where Lauren had dropped it 5 years ago. And I said, "It's in the linen closet, where we agreed it would stay." "Oh." She made a small noise that was something like disappointment, or maybe just the sound of someone realizing they would have to do something themselves. "Well, I can't reach it very well. Could you grab it for me?" I was standing in a pool of cold water from the melted snow on my boots, still wearing my work jacket, and I could feel the specific ache that comes from a day of being needed and never really thanked. But I nodded, and I went upstairs, and I retrieved the heating pad from the linen closet, and I helped her plug it in on the living room floor beside her chair, and she said thank you, in a way that made it sound like I'd been doing her an enormous favor all along. I didn't tell her I'd worked an extra 2 hours. I didn't tell her that my paycheck would be slightly larger this week because of it, and that the slightly larger paycheck was the only reason the mortgage payment would clear on time. I didn't say these things because they felt like complaints, and complaints in this house have a way of becoming evidence of ingratitude. The refrigerator, when I opened it an hour later, contained a half-full carton of milk, 3 eggs in a compartment, a bottle of salsa that had been there since September, and on the second shelf, my meal containers. 5 glass containers, precisely labeled with the dates, filled with rice and vegetables and protein, the week's nutrition arranged and managed by my own hands, my own time. I had prepped them on Sunday morning before work, using the hour before my shift began, standing in the kitchen while my mother watched television and my sister slept until noon. This had been my life for 7 years, since my father died. Since he'd asked me, in the hospital, with his hand weak in mine, to look after the house. "To look after your mother," he'd said, "just until she gets back on her feet. Just for a while." He meant well. I've never doubted that. He was a kind man, the kind who believed that people were essentially good and that hard times were temporary by definition. He believed that my mother was grieving because she hadn't yet found the right way to start again. And he believed that my sister was reckless because she hadn't yet found the right motivation. And he believed that I was capable of absolutely anything because I had always done whatever he asked. And I had always made it look effortless. I was 22 when he died. 22 and just starting at the distribution company, having skipped the college path because I wanted to work, because I liked the clarity of logistics, because I was good at it. I was promoted to supervisor by 24, and I was already managing 11 people and overseeing shipments for 3 states when my father's heart gave out on a Tuesday afternoon while he was sitting in his car in the parking lot of a hardware store, buying nails for something he'd been meaning to fix. My mother inherited the house. It was completely paid off. My father had been careful about that. He had wanted them to have security. But the property taxes were a problem. The maintenance was a problem. The sudden loss of his insurance on a house that was larger than we needed became a very specific kind of problem, and I solved it the same way I solved every problem, by taking on more. I moved back from my apartment. I consolidated my bedroom with Lauren's storage. She'd been living in Chicago for 2 years at that point, finding herself, which mostly meant changing jobs every 9 months, and calling to ask if she could stay, just for a few weeks, whenever things got complicated. I started paying the mortgage. Not with my mother's permission exactly. It simply became clear, through a series of unsigned understandings, that the mortgage was now my responsibility. The heating bills came next, then the property taxes, then the groceries, which meant no one else had to do it, which meant I was constantly calculating what would stretch the furthest, what we could get by without. I did the cooking when I was home, which was rare, so I batch prepared everything on my 1 day off. I did the laundry. I cleaned the kitchen. I worked my job, and I worked my house. And somewhere in that collapse of my own needs, I became infrastructure. By the time I was 26, I'd turned down a promotion. It was out of state. Colorado, actually. A regional manager position with a company that had scouted me at an industry conference. It came with a 30% raise and relocation assistance, and the kind of trajectory that people dream about. The email was still in my inbox, printed out and stored in a folder on my dresser, the letterhead slightly yellowed. I'd never quite deleted it, the way I'd never quite let myself forget what I'd chosen instead. My mother had cried when I told her I couldn't take it. Not angry tears, sad tears, the kind of tears that made her shoulders small and her voice smaller, and she'd said she understood. Of course she understood. She'd never want to be the reason I gave up my dreams. But she didn't know what she'd do without me. And she'd been alone since your father died. And it was just too much to ask me to leave her alone. I had hugged her. She had felt fragile in my arms, and I had convinced myself that this was love, that this choice was maturity, that learning to sacrifice was learning to be a good daughter, that the guilt I felt was actually conscience, that the burning in my chest was actually virtue. By the time I was 28, I had stopped expecting it to be temporary. My sister came back to the house on a Thursday afternoon without warning. She called as I was leaving work, her voice bright in that way that meant she wanted something. "Hey babe," she said, "is Mom home?" I was getting into my car, and the wind was kicking up, and I had to press the phone harder against my ear to hear her over the ambient noise of the parking lot. I was already thinking about what I needed to stop and buy on the way home. Milk, probably, and bread, and something for dinner because I'd used my Sunday window to work extra hours. "She's home," I said. "Why?" "I just need to talk to her about something. We're thinking about moving back to the area, just for a little while to get back on our feet. Me and Evan. His job situation is kind of falling apart and we thought it would be good to..." "Lauren." I stood beside the car with my hand on the door, and I could see my own breath in the cold. "Is Mom expecting you?" I called her yesterday and mentioned the possibility, but this all came together really fast, and I know it's short notice, but I was thinking maybe I could move into my old room, just until we get sorted out. It shouldn't be more than a few months, maybe 6 at most, and Evan says he can find something local pretty quickly, so... "Let me talk to Mom," I said, and I hung up the phone. My mother, when I asked her, was apologetic in that way that meant she wasn't very apologetic at all. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she explained that Lauren had called, and of course she'd always welcome her children home, especially in difficult times, and she was sure we could manage somehow. And surely I wasn't upset with her for wanting to help her own daughter. And anyway, it would be nice to have someone around during the day while I was at work. "There's the spare room," I said. "She can use the spare room." My mother's face did this small thing, this subtle retreat. "Well," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about how much I dislike being alone in the house, and I thought perhaps Lauren could use her room, and you could move into the spare room. And that way I wouldn't feel quite so isolated at night. I stood in the kitchen. I was still wearing my work jacket. I hadn't even set down my bag. "You want me to move?" I said. "I know it's inconvenient, darling, but—" "I painted that room," I said. "When I came back, I painted it exactly how I wanted it." She made the sound again, that small noise of regret that wasn't quite a real apology. "I know, and I'm sure you can paint the spare room too. It will be fine, won't it? Your sister needs her own space, and she always loved that room." I moved out of the kitchen. I went upstairs, and I stood in the room I'd painted. A soft, gray-blue color I'd chosen specifically because it was calming. Because I'd spent so much of my life reacting to crisis that I thought I deserved walls that didn't demand anything from me. They would become Lauren's walls again. The furniture I'd selected, the dresser I'd paid for, the white curtains I'd hung, they would become the backdrop for my sister's temporary situation. I packed a suitcase that night, moved my belongings into the spare room, which was small and faced the street and had a window that rattled in its frame, and I went to bed without saying another word to anyone. Lauren and Evan arrived 4 days later, pulling up in a car I didn't recognize, and loading boxes into the house in a chaos of activity and noise. Lauren had always moved through the world like she was the protagonist of her own movie, quick and confident, and always already looking ahead to the next scene. She hugged my mother. She kissed my cheek. She said, "Thanks for letting us crash, babe," in a tone that made it sound like she was thanking me for something I'd chosen to do, rather than something that had been decided for me. Evan was quieter. He moved the boxes in with the kind of careful efficiency that suggested he was trying not to take up too much space. But there was something in his expression, a sort of satisfied relief, that indicated he knew exactly how soft a landing this was. No rent, no responsibilities, just the space to exist at someone else's expense. What happened next didn't happen all at once. It was incremental, the way erosion is incremental, a series of small decisions that added up to a complete reorganization of my existence. My car, which had been mine since I was 25, became the family car. Lauren needed to borrow it for job interviews. Evan needed to borrow it because his car wasn't running right. My mother needed it for doctor's appointments. It was always going to be temporary. It was always just this once. By the end of the second week, I was using the bus to get to work, standing in the cold in the morning, arriving home later because the schedule required transfers, sitting in the dark while Lauren and Evan went to restaurants I'd never heard of, places they'd found through friends who seemed to materialize when there was free food involved. The bills started piling up. Lauren didn't have employment yet, and Evan's situation, as my mother had called it, turned out to be more dire than anyone had initially suggested. He'd been fired, not laid off. For performance issues, for poor attitude, for reasons he explained vaguely while eating the food I'd bought, his tone suggesting that these were other people's problems with his character, not character problems themselves. My mother, in her careful way, suggested that perhaps I could help with some of Lauren's expenses. Just for now, until she found work, just to keep things running smoothly. I said no. It was the first time I'd said no in several years, and the word felt strange in my mouth, wrong, like I was speaking a language I'd never quite mastered. My mother looked at me with an expression of such wounded surprise that I almost immediately retracted it. "I see," she said. And she said nothing else. But the silence that followed had weight. It had presence. It filled the room the way her earlier manipulations had filled the room when I was 16, and she'd cried about how ungrateful I was for not doing my sister's laundry, how selfish it was that I wanted to go out with friends instead of staying home with her, how I clearly didn't love her very much if I could be so easily swayed by my own desires. I lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, I transferred $300 into a joint account that my mother had opened with my social security number and my signature when I first moved back. An account that I'd been funding for 7 years, the way you feed a plant you've been told is dying, because that's how she'd explained it. We need to protect the house together, and this way we can both ensure the bills are paid. I hadn't really thought about what that meant. That every dollar I earned had gone into an account with my name on it. Yes, but an account I couldn't control alone. That I'd never actually checked the balance. That I'd never asked questions about where the money went beyond the obvious bills, the ones I could see and verify. That I'd simply trusted that it was being used for the house, the way I'd trusted that my father's words, "just until she gets back on her feet," were an accurate assessment of how long I'd be supporting her. The $300 disappeared by the end of the week. There was a water bill. There was a property tax notice that had arrived. There was the electric bill, higher than usual because someone had been using the heat in the daytime, turning it up without checking if it was necessary. There was money for groceries, though when I came home and checked the fridge, most of what I'd bought was gone, eaten by people who didn't have to think about where the money came from. I started working more shifts, double shifts when I could get them, staying late when the department had delays, coming in on my days off when other people called in sick. My supervisor, Daniel Harris, asked me if everything was okay. He was a good man, the kind who'd noticed I was working 60-hour weeks and was worried rather than just grateful. He offered solutions: time off, a pay raise that he said I'd earned, resources for whatever was happening at home. I told him I was fine. I told him everything was fine. I told him I just liked having the extra income, and he looked at me like he didn't believe me, but he didn't push, and I was grateful for that. It was one of the extra shifts, a night when I'd volunteered to help with an inventory reorganization, that I overheard a conversation between Lauren and Evan that changed something fundamental in how I understood what was happening to me. They were sitting in the living room when I got home, around 11 at night, the television still on but muted, and they didn't realize I was there until I was already in the kitchen, and their voices carried through the open doorway. "She's going to keep doing it," Lauren was saying. "She always does. She handles everything. You think she'll be okay?" Evan. He sounded genuinely curious, the way someone might ask about a machine and whether it would keep functioning. "She's Allison. She's always okay. That's her whole thing, right? Like, she could probably handle this forever if we needed her to. She's not going to fall apart or anything. She's too responsible." I stood in the kitchen. I didn't turn on the light. I simply stood in the darkness, and I felt something happen inside my chest. Something small and specific. The sound of a lock clicking open. That night, I accessed the joint bank account online for the first time in months. I logged into the website, and I checked the balance, and I calculated what had gone in and what had gone out, and I realized that in the past month alone, I'd contributed nearly $5,000, and approximately $3,000 of that had left the account for purposes I couldn't identify. Water, electric, mortgage, these were documented. But there were also transfers to cash, multiple withdrawals, charges at restaurants and online stores. I pulled the last 3 months of statements. I printed them at work the next day, on my lunch break, and I read through every line item. And I felt the way you feel when you've been living in a story that someone else wrote for you and you suddenly read it from the outside. It had been planned. The move back had been discussed for at least 6 weeks before I was told. I knew this because there were transfers to a moving company on the account, charges to an apartment finder, a deposit to hold a rental. My mother had known. She'd been preparing for it, moving money around, my money around, to absorb the cost of my sister's relocation. I made an appointment with a therapist. I found her on the insurance website, Dr. Myers, who had an evening slot and who specialized in family trauma, which was the terminology I used when I called, feeling foolish and embarrassed, like I was exaggerating my problems, like what was happening to me wasn't actually harmful, because no one was shouting or hitting. They were just slowly dismantling my sense of what I was worth. Dr. Myers, in our first session, asked me to describe my childhood, and I spent 40 minutes talking about my father, who was kind and optimistic, and who believed that love was demonstrated through actions, through providing, through sacrifice. I talked about my mother, who had been fragile even before my father died, who had needed managing, who had taught me that other people's emotional comfort was my responsibility. I talked about my sister, who was charming and unreliable, and who had always operated under the assumption that someone would rescue her, And eventually, someone did. She was right. When did it become your job? Dr. Myers asked. I don't know, I said. It always was. No, she said gently. Your father asked you to help. When you were 22. That was his request. But somewhere, you decided that it was permanent. That it was your life's purpose. When did that decision get made? I didn't have an answer. Or rather, I had many answers. Small moments of choice stacked on top of each other. Each one feeling necessary at the time. Each one feeling like the only possible response to the situation I'd been given. By the time I understood that I'd constructed a prison, I was already inside it. Guilt is not responsibility, Dr. Myers said to me on my third visit. You can feel guilty about a decision and still know that it was the right one to make. You can feel guilty about leaving and you can still need to leave. I can't just abandon them, I said. Providing resources is not abandonment, she said. Refusing to set fire to your own life is not abandonment. They are adults, even your mother. She is capable of managing her own housing, her own food, her own emotional health. She has taught you that she cannot do these things, but that is a different statement from the truth. I left that session, and I sat in my car in the parking lot, and I cried in a way I haven't cried since my father died. Not the quiet tears of stress or exhaustion, but the deep, gasping kind of crying that comes from the realization that you have allowed yourself to be consumed. When I got home, I looked at my room, the small spare room with the rattling window, and I thought about the room I'd painted, and the promotion I'd turned down, and the 7 years of my life that had been poured into a house that wasn't mine, and a family that didn't love me as a person, but as an asset. I accepted the out-of-state position. The same position that had been offered 5 years earlier had come available again, almost identical, and Daniel Harris had helped me get my resume in front of the hiring manager. When the offer came through, I said yes before I could convince myself to say no. The position was in Denver. The salary was even better than before. The start date was 6 weeks away. I had just enough time to arrange my escape. I told my mother on a Wednesday night. I sat at the dinner table, which I had cooked for naturally, and I said I'd been offered a promotion, a significant one, and I was going to take it. She set down her fork. I see, she said, and her voice was very small. And what about the house? What about your mortgage? I'll continue to make the payments for 3 months, I said. I had calculated this carefully. I had to leave her with something that would buy time and prevent the immediate crisis that might have motivated her to come after me, legally or otherwise. After that, you'll need to find another solution. Perhaps Lauren and Evan could contribute. Perhaps you could downsize. But I can't do this anymore. You can't, she repeated, and she made that wounded sound again. That's what this is about, isn't it? You can't be bothered. No, I said. It's about the fact that I was 22 when my father asked for help, and he's dead. And it's been 7 years, and no one has ever acknowledged that sacrifice. No one has ever said thank you. No one has ever asked if I was okay, or if I wanted something different. You've simply assumed it was my job forever, and I've allowed that assumption to be true. I stood up, and I cleared the table, and no one else moved to help, and I realized that this was how it had always been. Me moving, them still. Me acting, them receiving. My function defined by their need. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. I needed to understand the joint account, and I needed to transfer my ownership of it, and I needed to put the mortgage situation into a format that was legally clear and emotionally irrelevant. The lawyer, a woman named Elizabeth Chen, helped me draft a letter that explained my withdrawal from financial responsibility for the household, effective the date of my employment start date, with 3 final mortgage payments to be made directly to the lender to prevent foreclosure. They might contest this, Elizabeth said. Your mother might claim that you have an obligation as a family member. Do I? I asked. No, she said. You don't. You're an adult. You are not responsible for housing another adult. You never were. I spent the next 5 weeks preparing the house for abandonment. I transferred all my documents to a safety deposit box. I moved my money to a new bank account, a new institution, one without my mother's name on anything. I systematically went through every photograph, every personal item, and I extracted the things that were mine, that had meaning for me, that I was not willing to leave to be forgotten or discarded. I donated my furniture to a charity. I canceled the utilities that were in my name. I contacted the water company and the electric company, and I explained that I was moving, and I provided a forwarding address for final bills. I was methodical and quiet, and I told no one what I was doing. Lauren and Evan went out to dinner on the evening I left. They had plans with friends, the kind of plans that materialized regularly, and that I'd become accustomed to not being invited to. My mother was in her room watching television. I loaded my car with the boxes I'd packed, the evidence of 7 years of my life condensed into something that fit in the trunk and the back seat. I left a note. Not a long one. Just something that said, "The final mortgage payment will be made on the 15th of January. After that, the house is your responsibility. You are capable of managing it. I'm sorry, but I can't anymore." I drove through the night. I drove away from the house on Eastbrook Avenue, away from the radiators and the stale air, away from the unspoken debts and the guilt that was not actually guilt, because guilt is something you owe, and I owed nothing. I drove toward Denver, toward the job that I'd turned down 5 years earlier because I hadn't yet understood that love doesn't require self-destruction, that loyalty doesn't require dissolution, that family can be a choice, or it can be a cage. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk out and lock the door behind you. I rented an apartment in a building with glass doors and a locked lobby. First time in my adult life that I controlled the boundary to my space. I bought a bed, not used, but new, chosen specifically by me, in a color and a style that I'd never been able to afford when my money was feeding other people. I bought groceries for one person. I learned how to cook without doing it in volume. I learned how to exist without an audience, without the constant peripheral awareness of other people's needs. My supervisor at the new job, a woman named Patricia, asked me in the first week if I'd recently gotten out of a bad relationship. I must have looked confused, because she clarified. "You have this look like you're surprised that you're allowed to be here, like you're waiting for someone to take it back." "Something like that," I said. "Well," she said, "you're very capable. You can stop waiting." 6 months into the new job, my mother showed up at my workplace. I was in a meeting, and my assistant came to find me, confused, saying there was a woman at the front desk asking for me, saying she was my mother, and I felt the specific sensation of the past reaching backward to grab my ankles. I went to the lobby. My mother was standing near the reception desk, and she looked smaller somehow. Though that might have been because I was seeing her from a distance. From outside the house where she'd always seemed to expand and fill everything. She was flanked by Lauren, who looked guilty, and a man I didn't recognize, who I later learned was an attorney. "We need to talk about the house," my mother said. Her voice was shaking, performing distress. I looked at her, and I felt nothing. Not love, not guilt, not even anger. Just a kind of sad clarity. "I'm at work," I said. "If you need to discuss something legally, contact my attorney." "Allison, I left you with 3 months of paid mortgage," I said. "I left you with a house that was paid off before I was born. I left you with the same resources I had, which is nothing. I didn't leave you with nothing. I left you with exactly what you built." And I turned around and I went back to my office and I closed the door, and when my assistant came to check on me an hour later, I told her I was fine, and I meant it. I was fine. I was better than fine. I was, for the first time in my adult life, okay. They did not follow up with the attorney. My mother called twice, months apart, and I didn't answer. My sister texted once asking if we could heal, and I responded with a single line telling her I forgave them both. But forgiveness didn't require a relationship. The message bounced back unread, which told me she'd blocked me, which was fine. That was fine. That was exactly the kind of healthy boundary that she was capable of implementing when she decided she needed to. A year after I left, I rented a car, and I drove back to the state I'd left. Not to the house. I didn't go there. But to the town, and I met with Mrs. Collins, my elderly neighbor from the street, who'd always noticed things. She told me that my mother had sold the house 6 months after I left, that Lauren and Evan had moved into an apartment with another couple, that my mother was living with a cousin in a smaller place. The mortgage payments I'd made had been enough, apparently, to give them the bridge to figure out their own situation. "You did what you could," Mrs. Collins said. We were sitting in a coffee shop, and she was 73 years old, and she'd always had a habit of saying things very directly. "I did what I had to do," I said. She smiled. "Yes, you finally did." I'm 29 now, and I live in Denver in an apartment with sunlight and quiet. I have a relationship with a woman named Sarah, who asked me early on what I wanted for dinner, and when I couldn't answer because I'd spent so long anticipating other people's preferences, she said we'd figure it out together. I work a job that values me. I sleep without guilt. I've started saving for a house, and it will be mine, and I will choose who comes through the door. I still have the printed email from the promotion I turned down 5 years ago. I keep it in a drawer as a reminder of what I chose. Not to punish myself, but to remember that I know the cost of sacrifice, and I choose now to pay it only for things that matter, for work that fulfills me, for relationships that are mutual, for myself, which is what my father would have wanted, I think. I believe that now. I believe that if he could see what I'd allowed to happen, what I'd allowed myself to become, he would be ashamed. Not of me, of them, of all of us for accepting that love could look like this, like disappearing, like slowly ceasing to exist as a person and becoming only a function. The guilt doesn't come anymore, not like it used to. Sometimes I'll see a story on the news about families in crisis, people without resources, and I'll think about my mother, and I'll think about sending money, and then I'll remember that she has more options than I ever did at any point in my life. I'll think about Lauren, and I'll think about how capable I've learned that people become when there's no one around to rescue them. Sometimes I'll think about my father, about those words, just until she gets back on her feet. And I understand now that he was a good man, but he was also naive. He thought that people who wanted to stand would try to stand. He didn't know, or maybe he did but couldn't admit, that some people prefer to rest forever if someone will do the work of holding them up. I'm not bitter about it. I'm clear. That's different. Clarity doesn't have the heat of bitterness. It's cool and it's still, and it lets me move forward without constantly looking backward. When someone asks about my family now, I tell them I'm not in contact. When someone suggests I should reconcile, I tell them that reconciliation requires both parties to acknowledge the harm, and I'm not waiting for that acknowledgement anymore. I've moved into a life that doesn't require it. I've built something, carefully and quietly and completely alone. A life that is mine, not a burden I carry for someone else, not an investment in a future that belongs to another person, just mine. And that, I've learned, is worth everything I gave up to get it.